For those of you who don't know, my name is Pastor Simon Roper. I'm the guy who put this together with Pastor Shala. So if you have a problem, you can blame me. I am a little bit nervous. It's been a while. It doesn't get easier over time, especially if you're out of practice. So, this is the last class. Have you had fun? Has it been good? Yeah, good. It's actually one of my favorite topics, maybe because of my scientific background. I just rather enjoyed it. So today, turn to 1 John. Okay, 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. Now you're thinking, what does that have to do with biblical psychology? Well, some of you may know what this passage is about. First century, there was a group of heretics known as Gnostics, Gnostics, and they had the false belief that matter was evil and that Jesus, therefore, could not have been matter, physical matter, and therefore he couldn't have been human. Now, just putting aside all the theological problems that come with that, the fact that the idea is that people sometimes have a very hyper-spiritual view of things. And the same thing can very easily get into the subject of biblical psychology. You have, between here and here, solid material, matter. You have material here called a brain. It's a real physical entity. And often as biblical students, biblical psychologists, we forget it and we don't understand the relevance. So, there's two views within the Christian church about the relationship between the soul and the brain. The first view is the dualistic view, Dualistic. And this view, is this thing running? Yeah, dualistic view. The dualistic view states that the brain and the soul are two completely separate entities. There's an influence between the two, but they're very separate. The other one is called the monistic. Oops. The monistic view. And the monistic view states that the soul basically is overlaid on top of the brain. It's the same thing. It's a bit like a bit of computer software running on computer hardware. I personally believe that maybe the reality is there's somewhere in between this. There is definitely the soul is definitely in the brain, but there's also an immaterial portion. There's a mystery that we cannot understand. But the point is, why do we need to know this? And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is just very basic introduction to the physiology, and more importantly, why it's important. Now, I'm not a medical guy. My training is in computers and automation. But I will teach you something very, very, very basic in terms of the brain structure and how it's important in what we learn about biblical psychology, and how we shouldn't be afraid of what secular psychologists have to say. Unless, of course, they're talking about evolution and stuff like that. But, there is a lot to be learnt by studying the brain. And I think also it helps us to understand what you've been taught for the last 3 months. Okay? With me so far? Good. I'm not sure I am. It's okay. I just appreciate your patience. Psalm 139, please. Verse 14. Psalm 139, verse 14. Unless you're turning quickly, I'm just probably end up speaking ahead of you. That's what it says. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. And the key thing here is we are wonderfully made. Man is the crown of God's creation. And the brain is the jewel in that crown. What God put here was a pretty amazing piece of machinery, especially when you consider how small it is. The average human brain is about 3 pounds. The average elephant brain is about 13 pounds. But the human brain is significantly more effective and more efficient than the elephant's brain. Not just on a natural realm, but also on a spiritual realm. But definitely, it's both. So, what does the brain look like? It's a while since I used this one. How do you get a new page? It's slide, isn't it? All it's doing is, and I do that, and I have one of these. I should have one of these at home. I should use it more often. Hey? Pinch it out. Got it. Got it. Thank you. I told you I'm a computer guy. Problem is Steve Jobs didn't think about us. Okay. So the human brain, 2 things, neurons and synapses. You've probably heard the terms. If any of you have done nursing or medical training, you're probably going to think, yeah, what does this guy know? But basically, the brain has 100 billion neurons. And that's just the beginning. Each neuron has, when you're born, 2,500 synapses per neuron. A synapse is basically a connection between 2 neurons. So each neuron is attached to 2,500 different neurons. As you grow older, it turns to 15,000 connections per neuron when you get to childhood. In adult, it drops down to about 7,500 as you go old. Dementia starts early in life. So, when you want to learn something, this is why kids can learn foreign languages. You get to early adulthood, it becomes very difficult. Because, in those years following childhood, half of your synapses just disappear, or they get weakened. But even so, the adult brain has 750 trillion connections between synapses. That's pretty, so that's a lot in this little thing here. I know it's nothing when you consider it to a microchip, but each neuron and synapse has probably got sub-processing power, and it's still far superior to the computer. So what kind of neurons do we have? We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, communication, and computational. Sensory neurons are neurons that are attached to the eyes, the ears, the nose, taste buds, and touch. Those are senses. Motor neurons are used to move your arms, legs, all that kind of stuff. And then there's communication between the various parts of the brain. Computational neurons are what most of the neurons are, or most of the synapses are. That's very, very, very basic. I hope it helps you. It helped me a lot. The bottom line is you have all these neurons and all these synapses, and they form what we call a neural network. But I'm not going to use that term because it's a little bit ambiguous. It's more like a brain pattern or a pattern of thinking. And this pattern can change. And it does through a principle known as neuroplasticity or synaptic pruning. Does anyone not have this? Okay. Do you have it? It's available on PDF. Because all the terminology is in here. So I want to be, if I don't write it down, then again, I can do that. Oh man. Neuroplasticity, synaptic pruning. Okay, I'm assuming we know what muscle atrophy is. What happens if we have muscles and we don't use them? They get flabby. Get old, you don't use your muscles, get flabby and eventually die, become worthless. It's the same with the synapses. We exercise our muscles, we get stronger. We don't, we get weaker. We exercise our brain, it gets stronger. We don't, it gets weaker. Synapses, if they're not used, communications, connection, if they're not used, will eventually die. At the same time, we can make new connections and new synaptic connections as we make decisions, we see things, we read things, we hear things. So there's a dynamic activity happening in the brain. And the brain is very, very adaptive. So it's plastic in nature in that it changes. And it prunes synapses that it doesn't want to use anymore, or that you choose not to use, because it's very efficient that way. And if you bring up new pathways, that's what you end up using. Eventually, over time, if you have a neuron that has no connections or synapses to it, or that aren't used, a neuron will die as well. It all comes down to the main idea of using your brain. So all of this happens because of our decisions, our thinking, our actions, everything we do and say and think affects the framework of the brain, the patterns in the brain, and the way we think. In a sense, our behavior and decisions do affect our future, but not so much in God's kingdom, but it is part of it. The reason it is you've got an empty green field, nice green field, it's all grass, and you walk through a certain path, and you keep walking the same path. Eventually, the grass will die. And eventually, you find that's the easiest way for you to go. It looks a little bit like this. If you have neuron number 1 and neuron number 2, and you can go that way, or you can go that way. But you always exercise this way. You always go this way. You always think this thought. Eventually, This becomes hard. We take the path of least resistance. So we develop patterns of thinking. If we always think about the same things every day, those thoughts become second nature to us. If we make decisions, those decisions become habits. Because we're developing pathways in our brain, we're eventually killing pathways that we're not using. Interesting? Now, okay, so what's the value of it? Well, does anyone I don't know how much people know about secular psychology, secular counseling, or the worst kind of thing, talk show hosts, daytime talk shows, where people go on and they just talk about their problems. This is my problem with this person and that person. Nothing ever gets resolved. Even in secular counseling, there's a lot of mindset in some of them. Just talk about your problems. Just talk about your problems. Just talk about your problems. What happens if you continually talking about your problem? It becomes a habit. It becomes actually, that neural pathway becomes stronger. And it becomes your identity. You know, it becomes much in your subconscious mind, which I'll talk about later. It becomes much stronger. And it becomes harder to break it. Something bad happens in our lives, and I don't condemn us for thinking about it, but something bad happens, a relationship problem, or someone hurts us. Keep talking it over and over and over again. It doesn't help us. It just makes us more and more miserable, because that becomes who we are. It is all we end up thinking about. And 5 years later, and you're still talking about some girlfriend that dumped you. It's like, well, yeah, you've thought about it for 5 years, and there's just nothing you can do about it. It's no different to the kind of things that happen if you do physical things. When I was when I was this high, whatever it was, when I was in about 10 or 11, school I went to, there was a guy, he liked playing football. It's a game you called soccer, but it's actually called football. And he liked heading the ball. He liked to head the ball. So he'd walk along and he'd jump up and down and he'd just pretend he was heading the ball. And he'd do it all day. Eventually, he would just constantly whenever he walked, every 10 paces, he'd just jump in the air just like a twitch. He just developed a twitch. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to make, You can beg if you want, but no. Eventually, he would just jump up, not to a proper heading position, but just jump. No reason. Because his mind had got used to doing this habit. This neural pathway had been developed. It's serious business. Now, we know that's not always a good thing. Christian counselors can often go the other extreme. If we're not caring, we just tell people to get over it, which is kind of dumb, or we just tell people not even think about it. Know yourself in Christ. That's the typical thing people use, which is fine. I agree with it. But sometimes there is something. Let's just turn quickly to Hebrews 12, verse 15. All right, Hebrews 12:15. Looking carefully, lest any one fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up, causing trouble, and by this many become defiled. I really want to think about this root of bitterness. I have a problem with somebody. No one in this room, but I do. I have a problem with somebody, and I don't want to talk about it because I don't want it to become I don't want it to become part of who I am. Does that mean I shouldn't deal with it? Should I just pretend it didn't happen? Should I make it like that football, that round football that I submerge underwater, and then when I let it go, it comes up again? We still have to deal with problems in our mind, but really it's more a case of giving it to God. Give it to God, yeah. Don't just play it over in your mind. It's just unhealthy for you. Probably one of the classic cases or situations where it happens is with alcoholics. You know, a guy who hasn't had a drink for 20 years and he calls himself a recovering alcoholic. Every time he uses that word, he says, I'm an alcoholic. He's defining with someone that he isn't. It's kind of like, well, what's the point? It's great that he hasn't had a drink for 20 years. And maybe, you know, if he meets somebody he hasn't seen for 15 years and he tells him, and that's great, he can say that. But it's when it becomes, I am a recovering alcoholic, it's like, no, you're not. You're not. I don't know whether you're saved or not, but that's not who you are. All right? Now, so we don't want to talk too much about our problems. What about our senses? Do they have an impact on the healthy state of the brain? Yeah. As I said earlier, all of our senses are connected to synapses and neurons. There's a connection. Therefore, what you hear and see affects the pattern of thinking inside your brain. So, classic one for the eyes. Pornography. There's one thing everyone tells you to avoid, pornography. And quite rightly too. Violence is another one. Although we tend not to stress that one quite so much. I'm not sure why, but we don't. But when these things go into our minds, not just the words, but images, they form pathways, and it's not just the images are stored in the brain, but maybe they form other ways of thinking. You start seeing women and you start thinking of a certain way, pattern of thinking. You start seeing gratuitous violence and you start thinking that killing has no consequences, new pattern of thinking. Everything you see affects brain patterns in the subconscious mind, which makes them hard to change. What about sound? I mean, we're told not to listen to negative reports. It's true. I mean, you think you can hear something negative and just cast it off. You can't. It happened to me 10, 12 years ago. I just had somebody around me who was always who left the church being very negative, and it definitely for a short period of time it affected my relationship to this ministry and to Pastor Schaller. I've told him about it, and he was happy to hear about it. You know, you think you can handle a negative report. That negative report makes new patterns of thinking, which are hard to erase. What about music? Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about that, don't we? I'm always a little bit careful when I hear people talking about music. But I understand there are certain forms of music, not just because they have demonic influence, but just because of the beat and the rhythm. It may be a personal choice, and maybe some people can handle it more than others. But certain form of music really just like don't do anything to the brain. And I'm going to talk about those later. Taste buds. Who likes eating? Okay. I got a guy I work with. He's a Christian, very similar. He'd fit in this church perfectly. He's a Christian. He's a wicked sinner. Perfect. He made a statement to me he said, whenever people get together, they always have either one thing. They either have alcohol or food. And with us, it's food. Have you been to a church event where there's no food? They're very, very, very unusual, very far, but they seem to be, it seems to be we can't drink, so let's just eat more. It's good, yeah. I'm on a diet, I shouldn't be talking about food. But taste buds. I mean, you taste alcohol. It's interesting, you taste alcohol, and maybe it's the first drink you've had. Or cigarettes, that's another one, cigarettes. First cigarette you ever have, and you go, oh my God, that's disgusting, you know. Maybe some of you smoke or used to smoke, know what I'm talking about. My father gave up, when he was alive, gave up years ago, and he said to me, if I had a cigarette now, I'd hate it. Oh, it tastes horrible. And I'd want another one in 20 minutes. Because it's just the taste of it can bring back memories. It isn't just the nicotine and the oxygen deprivation that kind of completely messes your brain. There's something in the taste, even though it's kind of nasty, especially with all the chemicals they add. But taste buds can affect the brain. Smell is another one. Intimacy and sacrifices. Generally, you don't think about too many negative things with respect to smell. When you smell things, it's kind of a reminder of something good or bad. It's actually a great, sign of intimacy. You can smell your children. You can smell your spouse. It's a good thing, most of the time. Unless they're 6 months old. What about touch? What about touch? The mother's touch. Anyone here from Romania? No Romanians. You had one and she went home. My stepdaughter went home last week. That's Friday. Oh well. Okay. Stepdaughter? Daughter-in-law. Stepdaughter-in-law. Okay. Yeah. During the communist regime, a lot of Romanian children were kept locked away, hidden in orphanages, and they were discovered after the eventual liberation of that country. And the thing that came out was for many of these kids, they'd never been touched. Never. And to me, this kind of like, what does it do to a kid's psyche? Like when you have kids, you touch your kids, stroke them on the head, just give them a hug, hold their hands. What does that develop in that child's brain? The touching of the skin, all those nerves, all the way up to the brain, developing pathways in the brain that are very healthy. Same with relationships. Husbands and wives should touch each other. Notice I said husbands and wives. Husbands and wives should touch each other, not girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, does anyone know why we teach no-touch love here? I'm not sure I do at times, but no, I do. One thing we don't like, we have a real issue with, and it's a very wise issue, is kissing. And you think, well, what's the big deal about kissing a boy or kissing a girl? Well, these lips, your lips are incredibly sensitive. Incredibly. One of the most sensitive parts of the human body, human flesh. So you kiss somebody, it's a huge sensory overload, and who knows where it can be. I remember hearing this years ago before I was a Christian. They were on one of the news channels, and they were just going through different couples in their dating rituals. And there was a Christian couple who had made a decision not only not to have sex, but not to kiss. And the one said, the reason we don't kiss is a practical reason, really. Because it's easier not to kiss my boyfriend than not to have sex once I've kissed my boyfriend. It's easier not to kiss my girlfriend than to stay than to stay pure once I've done it. So right here, I am a decision. I've got a decision to make not to kiss. If I'm dating, not to kiss. That's an easy decision. But when I kiss, I'm walking to the edge of a precipice. And I'm thinking, now I've got to make a decision not to have sex. It's a lot harder. It's easier not to kiss than not to have sex. That makes sense? Good. You believe that, or are you just saying that? It's not easy. I mean, you know what? It's a natural desire, and I understand the temptation. But once you've opened the door, it's hard to close. Okay, this is why John Bunyan, you know who he is? Pilgrim's Progress. He wrote a book, and he developed this idea of gates. Eye gates, ear gates. You'll hear Pastor Stevens use them, but they actually go back all the way to John Bunyan. And he had this idea that you have 5 gates on the soul, the village of man's soul, and you protect these gates. You protect your senses, because your senses they will affect real things in the brain. And once they're there, they're hard to get rid of. Okay. All right, next subject, Mark 2:27. If any of you have questions that you really have to have answered now, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I may be able to answer some later on. As I say, it's been a while since I did this, and my understanding of timekeeping isn't as good as it used to be. So Mark 2:27. I'm going to talk about disciplines for keeping the brain healthy. And he, Jesus, said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." God gave us a Sabbath because he wanted us to rest. Now, we're very good at talking about resting the body and taking care of the body. But do we understand that we need to take care of the brain? I mean, if I start thinking of the soul as just some kind of hyper-spiritual kind of goo that just lives there, I don't worry about rest. But once I get into my mind that this is a chemical and biological reaction between my ears, then maybe the idea of rest suddenly makes sense to me. We need to rest. What happens? There are people who can live on 4 hours sleep a night. There are people who, if they don't get 8, they're useless. If they don't get 10, they're useless. Most people are in the 6, 7, 8 hours a night realm. There are people that kind of weird and they can get away on 4. I've tried it for a few days. It's not too successful. What happens when you don't sleep? You can't think, can you? I mean, okay, you're physically tired. That's one thing. But can you think? Do you think? You ever got emotional when you're tired? Probably. I won't admit it, but you have. Can you think consciously? Do you think you're susceptible to demonic activity when you're tired? Do you think the brain's ability to fight, I know that sounds like a bit of a natural thing, but do you think the ability of the brain to fight attacks is diminished? Yeah. Anybody ever had daydreams or day nightmares? Or am I the only one that has those? If I'm tired, if I don't get enough sleep, I get very irritable. I can be nasty at times. Not really, yeah, maybe. Sometimes I'll have flashbacks. And just my brain starts thinking about things, and I'm just like, what's going on here? And I have images that I didn't know I had or that I can't explain because my brain's ability to process what's going on is just diminished. I need to rest my brain. Why God told us to rest. He's not just saying rest the body, rest your arms and your legs and all that kind of, rest your brain. No, it's good for you and healthy. What else? Well, how about exercising the brain? I talked about working out, building up those muscles. How do we exercise the brain? How do we really kind of help the brain to build up? How many of you like Pastor Charlotte's pictures? Well, not enough, you know. Karen's keeping an eye on you. If any arms not up, we'll be failing. Yeah, I like pictures too. I mean, how many people do sketchboard? Got some sketchboarders here. We're visual. You know, we like sight and sound because it makes the picture bigger. When people draw pictures, when somebody has it on the stage and there's students doing a play, it brings something to life. It's something you already know, but it makes it bigger. It exercises the brain so that now it becomes more of the brain's involved. The thought process kind of expands, the memory expands, it becomes more and deeper in who you are. It's the same thing with music. Music can either be good for the brain or very bad. Certain forms of music that have 3 notes, 1 beat, and it's like that for 10 minutes. It's really loud, and there's a lot of bass. Your brain hurts. I used to like it. Then I got old. No, I never really did, but not quite like that. It's not good for the brain. What about Mozart? Beethoven? What about those kind of guys who had extremely complex melodies and complex harmonies, varied beats, different tempos, there's the sounds of the violin and the trumpets, and all have a different sound to them. Do they stretch? When you listen to the complexity of, there's all sorts of things going on. They're all coming into your ear and they're all dancing around the brain. Exercising your mind rather than 3 notes. It's like, I had to go to a certain store a few weeks ago when I had to walk out because I couldn't take it anymore. It's just too much. And I think, the reason we do this is because we've got a network in the brain. We're not linear. Everything's connected to something else. Everything's interconnected. Other things we can do. Reading books is very, very good. I didn't do it until I was about 30. I was a bad boy. I would never read when I was in high school. But I recovered. I haven't done much recently, but reading stretches the mind. It stretches the imagination. Because you actually, you read something of a novel, and you imagine yourself there. So you read a missionary biography, and you can imagine yourself there, developing thought patterns. Here's a good one. Mathematics is a good one for exercising the brain. Only kidding. I like mathematics. It's all a great way of just kind of exercising. Okay, thank you for your patience. So we've talked about good habits, like music and reading and anything academic and looking at pictures. What about the bad things? What are the bad things that are the things that are really bad? Drugs, alcohol, all those kind of things, right? Now, I did actually, in the book, I have a whole list of things. I'm going to cover a couple of them. Before I do that, I want to talk briefly about medication. Is medication okay? Don't answer. Don't answer. For some Christians, it's a real issue. For others it's not. Some years ago, senior pastor at his church said something which was a pleasant surprise to me. We were driving back from outreach, and we just seen some kid in the parking lot, and he said, "Problem with that kid is he won't take his medication." I looked at him and said, "What did you say? He won't take his medication." You said that? Yeah. Medication's okay if it's the right medication, it's properly prescribed, if it can help you get to the root of your problem. If you have a chemical imbalance in the brain, maybe you should deal with it. I mean, if you think about the effects of alcohol on the brain, the negative effects, what's the best way of curing them? Not to drink alcohol. That makes a chemical change in the brain. So maybe there are certain drugs that can help. I'm not going to sort of recommend that because obviously there are trained psychologists who understand the side effects, understand the consequences. You should never do such things just because. But I wouldn't necessarily speak against them. So what about the negative ones? Well, I got a whole list of them here. Alcohol, no. None of us know what alcohol does to us, right? Some of us older folks do, maybe. Amphetamines or speed, caffeine, cocaine, heroin. Things like LSD, which was very big in the 60s. It's hallucinogenic, which means it actually makes you think weird things. People have flashbacks 10, 20, 30 years later. So they go to these pop festivals, they go to Woodstock in the 60s, they take this stuff, and they get high, and they go, hey, this is great. And then they enter normal life again, and 20 years later, these things just keep coming back. And there's nothing really you can do about them. PCP, angel dust. You've probably heard that on TV, on movies. Leads to seizures and schizophrenia. Alcohol is almost mild in comparison, but it isn't. You've got solvents which cause all sorts of hallucinations and memory loss. Just about every drug people take to make themselves feel good, it's either a high or a low or a hallucinogenic, whatever they do, it all has nasty side effects. And the reason is, there is a spiritual aspect to this. The word witchcraft is actually the Greek word meaning pharmakia, which is pharmacy or drugs. There is definitely a spirit of demonic activity in these drugs. So, it's 10 after 7. I'm going to give you a few. How long do you normally take? 10 minutes? 10 minutes. We'll meet back here 20 after 7, and we'll continue from there.